The storm tore through Briar Hollow as a massive tree branch began to crack in the darkness. An old woman stood trapped near her porch, seconds away from disaster. A Navy SEAL and his canine sensed the danger before it struck. The dog stopped suddenly, forcing the soldier to change direction. A heavy branch crashed down where they had been standing moments earlier. The soldier pulled the woman to safety while the canine stood guard against the falling debris. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and like, share, and subscribe to Canine and Seal Stories. Briar Hollow had always been the kind of town that believed it could endure anything simply by being old enough. Its streets curved instead of running straight, as if they had learned long ago that resisting nature was pointless. And its buildings leaned slightly with age, stubborn rather than fragile. When the weather alert scrolled across every television screen that afternoon, severe storm warning, high winds, falling trees likely, most people nodded, closed their curtains, and told themselves they had seen worse. Trees had fallen before. Roofs had been torn loose before. Briar Hollow survived by lowering its head and waiting things out. Wyatt Mercer did not own a television. The warning reached him through the thin walls of the rented room above a closed bait shop, carried in the anxious voice of the radio announcer downstairs. Wyatt sat on the edge of a narrow bed, elbows on his knees, boots already laced. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and disciplined in posture even when seated, with an angular, rugged face that looked carved rather than grown. His sharp jawline was clean-shaven, his expression unreadable, his cold blue-gray eyes steady and distant. His hair was cut in a modern, neat undercut. Tight, faded sides, short, textured top. Practical and exact, as if anything less would be wasteful. The complete green digital camouflage uniform he wore was standard issue. Blouse and trousers perfectly fitted and fully buttoned, held by a plain black belt and grounded by plain black combat boots. He wore nothing extra. No weapon, no pack, no symbols. He stood ready without advertising readiness. He did not move when the radio mentioned evacuation routes. He had learned long ago that panic wasted energy. Across the room, Coda lifted his head. The Belgian Malinois was fully grown, 4 or 5 years old, lean and muscular, with a deep fawn to mahogany coat that darkened along his spine. A distinct black mask framed his face, sharpening the intensity of his dark amber eyes. His ears rose upright as if pulled by invisible strings, and his entire posture shifted from rest to alert without a sound. The tan tactical canine vest hugged his body snugly, worn but clean, paired with a simple working dog collar. Coda did not bark. He did not pace. He simply sat taller, head angled slightly toward the window, nostrils flaring as if the wind itself carried a language only he could hear. Wyatt noticed that. He always noticed that. Coda had learned storms the way some men learned faces. The pressure change, the electrical taste in the air, the way the building's old wood tightened before it complained. When Coda reacted like this, silent, focused, waiting, it meant something was coming that could not be ignored. Outside, the sky darkened earlier than it should have. The wind began not as a howl, but as a low, sustained breath, pushing against walls and corners, testing weaknesses. Wyatt rose to his feet, movements economical, calm. He crossed to the window and looked out over the street where the lamps flickered, their light trembling like nervous hands. Then the power went out. The building exhaled a collective creak, and somewhere far off, a siren began to wail. Wyatt had just turned back toward the bed when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was thin, broken, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakably human. A voice, pulled apart by distance and rain. "Help!" Coda moved first. Not with chaos, not with barking, but with intent. He crossed the room in 3 strides, seized the sleeve of Wyatt's blouse between his teeth, and tugged once, hard. His eyes locked onto Wyatt's face, then flicked toward the door. Wyatt did not hesitate. He followed. They were halfway down the stairs when the wind slammed the building so hard the railing shuddered. Outside, rain drove sideways, needles against skin, and debris skittered along the pavement. Coda pulled again, guiding Wyatt not toward the main street, but down a narrow side alley that smelled of wet leaves and old oil. The dog's body angled left, then right, adjusting course with a precision that felt rehearsed. The second cry reached them near the end of the alley, louder now, tinged with fear. The house stood beside an old repair and antiques shop, its windows dark, its porch sagging with age. A massive oak tree loomed above it, its roots partially torn free from the soaked ground. The trunk had split with a sound like a gunshot, and now the upper half leaned dangerously toward the porch roof, held aloft only by stubborn fibers and chance. At the front door stood an elderly woman, frozen mid-step. Evelyn Harrow, Evie to those who knew her, was small but not frail, her frame compact and hardened by years of work. Her silver-white hair was pulled into a low, practical bun at the nape of her neck, already coming loose in the rain. Her lined face was sharp with pain and concentration, gray eyes wide but defiant. She wore a thick charcoal cardigan over a pale checked shirt, dark trousers soaked at the cuffs, and old leather boots with worn soles meant to resist slipping. A ring of keys hung from a cord at her chest, clutched in one hand as if they anchored her to the world. One foot had slid on the wet step, leaving her twisted sideways, unable to move forward or back. Above her, the oak groaned. Wyatt ran. But Coda cut in front of him, body angling sharply to the right, blocking the most direct path. He planted his paws and leaned into Wyatt's legs, forcing him to shift. Wyatt barely had time to register the correction before the sound came. A violent crack, deep and final. A massive limb tore free and slammed down exactly where Wyatt would have been standing. The impact shook the ground. Shards of wood exploded outward, one jagged edge slicing through the porch railing. Evie screamed. Wyatt adjusted instantly, taking the new angle Coda had forced on him. He reached Evie, wrapped one arm around her shoulders and the other around her waist, and pulled her back just as the rest of the branch collapsed. She cried out as her feet slid, pain flashing across her face. But she did not resist. She trusted his grip. Coda pressed in close, positioning his body between Evie and the splintered remains of the railing. A sharp edge scraped against the vest on his flank instead of her skin. He did not flinch. Together, they moved, Wyatt dragging, Evie stumbling, Coda shielding, until they cleared the porch entirely. Another thunderous crash followed as the oak finally gave up, crushing the roof in a spray of shingles and dust. For a moment, the world was nothing but rain and noise. Then it quieted, leaving only the storm's distant roar. Evie sagged against Wyatt, breath coming in ragged bursts. Wyatt lowered her carefully to a sitting position against the side wall of the shop, his hands steady, his voice low and controlled as he checked her for injuries. She was shaking, whether from pain or shock, he could not yet tell. Coda stood directly in front of her, body rigid, eyes tracking the darkness, every sense still on watch. Coda suddenly shifted, ears snapping toward the collapsed porch. He stepped forward, nose low, then stopped abruptly and sat, hard, blocking Wyatt from moving closer. His gaze fixed on a section of fallen debris, and a low, almost inaudible sound vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, a warning. Wyatt followed Coda's line of sight just as another section of the roof caved inward, sending a cascade of soaked boards down where he had been about to step. Wyatt exhaled slowly. Even after everything he had seen in his life, that timing chilled him. When he looked back, Evie was staring at both of them, rain streaking down her lined face, eyes sharp despite the shock. There was fear there, but also calculation, recognition. "You didn't run," she said hoarsely. "Most people run." Wyatt shook his head once. Didn't seem smart. Her gaze dropped to Coda, who finally relaxed just enough to breathe normally. "And he didn't make a sound," she murmured. "He knew." Wyatt rested a hand briefly on Coda's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the vest. "He usually does." Evie looked up at Wyatt again, studying his uniform, his posture, the way he held himself as if chaos were something he negotiated with rather than feared. The storm raged on around them, but in that narrow space beside the ruined porch, something shifted. Not gratitude, not relief alone. Curiosity. "You're not from here," she said. "No, ma'am." She nodded slowly, as if filing the answer away for later. Her fingers tightened around the keys at her chest, then loosened. "Well," she said, voice steadier now, "you and your dog just saved my life." Wyatt met her gaze, rain tracing clean lines down his face. "Just doing what needed doing." Evie looked at Coda once more, then back at Wyatt. And for the first time since the storm had begun, a faint, knowing expression crossed her face. One that suggested she had just met someone she would not forget. Morning came to Briar Hollow the way it always did after violence. Quiet, embarrassed, pretending nothing permanent had happened. The storm clouds had broken apart during the night, leaving behind a pale sky scraped thin by wind. Streets were littered with branches, shingles, and twisted sheets of tin that flashed dull silver in the weak sunlight. Water pooled at the edges of the road, carrying leaves and bits of someone's past toward the storm drains. The town smelled of wet wood, rust, and cold earth. Wyatt Mercer stood across the street from the building he had helped save the night before. In daylight, the damage looked worse. The oak tree lay where it had fallen, its massive trunk split open like exposed bone. Half the porch roof was gone. Windows were cracked, one completely shattered. Yet the structure still stood, stubborn in the way old things sometimes were. Wyatt noted all of it automatically. The load-bearing points, the angle of the remaining beams, the places that would need shoring before the next hard wind. He had learned to assess damage the same way other people read weather reports. Beside him, Coda sat with disciplined stillness, tan vest darkened in places where rain had soaked through. The Belgian Malinois was already back in work mode, lean body angled slightly forward, ears upright, eyes scanning. His deep, fawn-to-mahogany coat caught the light, and the black mask across his face made his expression seem permanently serious. He smelled the air in short, deliberate breaths, tracking lingering scents the storm had not washed away. Across the street, the door to the adjacent shop opened. Evelyn Harrow stepped out with measured care, one hand braced against the frame. In the daylight, she looked smaller than she had in the storm, but no less solid. Her cardigan hung heavy with damp, and faint purple bruises had already bloomed along one forearm where Wyatt had pulled her free. Her silver hair was still twisted into its low bun, though several strands had escaped and framed her face. The lines around her eyes were deeper now, etched by exhaustion more than fear. She looked directly at Wyatt. Not the building, not the tree. Him. "You," she said, voice rough but steady. "Come here." Wyatt crossed the street without comment. Coda rose and followed at his left, close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned. Inside Harrow & Son Repairs plus Antiques, the storm had left its mark in quieter ways. Water had seeped under the door, warping the edges of the wooden floorboards. Several shelves had tipped, scattering old radios, lamps, and brass fittings across the floor. The air carried the mixed scent of dust, oil, and something metallic, sharp enough that Coda's nose twitched almost immediately. Evie moved behind the counter with practiced familiarity, set a kettle on a portable gas burner, and began filling 2 chipped mugs. She did not ask Wyatt if he wanted coffee. She assumed. "Sit," she said, nodding toward a chair near the counter. Wyatt sat. Coda remained standing for a moment, then settled at Wyatt's feet, head up, gaze moving slowly from the door to the floor to the back of the shop. Evie slid a mug across the counter. "Drink. You look like someone who forgets to." Wyatt wrapped his hands around the mug. The heat seeped into his palms, sharp and grounding. "Thank you." She waved the words away with a flick of her fingers. "Don't thank me yet. I'm not done." They drank in silence for a few moments. Outside, a truck rumbled past, hauling debris. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed too loudly, the brittle sound of relief. "This place," Evie said at last, gesturing around them, "is my whole life. Was my husband's too." Her eyes drifted to a black and white photograph on the wall behind the counter, showing a younger version of herself beside a tall man with broad shoulders and grease-stained hands. "He built most of it. The benches, the cabinets, fixed things people thought were broken for good." Wyatt followed her gaze but said nothing. "He's been gone 12 years, she continued. "No children, no family worth mentioning. Just this." She tapped the counter. "And lately, people who think that means I'm ready to let go." Coda rose and padded a few steps toward the back of the shop, nose low. He stopped near a section of floor where the boards were darker, swollen from moisture. He sniffed again, slower this time, then circled once and sat, head tilted slightly as if listening. Wyatt noticed. He always did. Evie followed Wyatt's line of sight. "He always do that?" she asked. "When something doesn't match," Wyatt said. "Smells off." She considered that, then shrugged. "This building's full of things that don't match." Wyatt set his mug aside and stood. He began righting shelves, lifting carefully, testing weight before committing. His movements were economical, efficient, every action serving a purpose. When he found a loose beam near the door, he braced it with a length of scrap wood and tightened it down without being asked. Evie watched him work, her sharp gray eyes missing nothing. After a few minutes, she noticed the way he paused occasionally, pressing 2 fingers briefly into his thigh or hip before continuing, as if checking whether his body would cooperate. "You're hurt," she said. "Old," Wyatt replied. She snorted. "That's not old. That's something that didn't heal right." Wyatt did not answer. He lifted another crate and set it down more gently than necessary. As the morning wore on, the shop slowly regained its shape. Coda moved with purpose, staying out of Wyatt's way but never far, occasionally stopping to sniff the same section of floor again and again. Once, he rose and walked over to the photograph on the wall. He sat in front of it, tail still, eyes fixed on the image of Evie's husband. Then he turned his head and looked back at Wyatt, holding the gaze longer than usual. The moment landed heavier than it should have. Wyatt felt it like a pressure behind his ribs. Coda was not asking for attention. He was not alerting to danger. He was marking something, as if the shop itself were making a decision. Evie noticed too. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "That's new," she said quietly. "He doesn't usually do that, does he?" "No," Wyatt admitted. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, the shop breathing softly around them. Then Evie cleared her throat and looked away first. "I'm not sentimental," she said. "Don't mistake this for gratitude talking." She reached into her cardigan and pulled out the ring of keys Wyatt had seen the night before. They clinked softly as she set them on the counter. "But I don't like owing people, and I don't like letting good work walk away." Wyatt frowned slightly. I know," she cut in. "That's the point." She slid the keys a few inches closer to him. "You got somewhere to go?" Wyatt thought of the rented room above the bait shop, the thin walls, the smell of rot and old fish. He thought of the way Coda had slept light all night, alert even in rest. "Not really." Evie nodded once, decision made. "There's a room upstairs. Used to be storage. Bed's old, but solid. You help me get this place back on its feet, keep an eye out for the next storm, and we call it even." Wyatt looked at the keys, then at Coda, who had returned to his position at Wyatt's side, posture calm, approving. "All right," Wyatt said. Evie studied him for a long second, then allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. "Good," she said. "Then welcome to Harrow & Son."
Dean Crowley arrived at Harrow & Son Repairs and Antiques just before noon, when the light fell straight down the narrow street and showed every flaw in the buildings it touched. His car, a dark, polished sedan that looked out of place among pickup trucks and utility vans, slid neatly into a space across the street, tires barely whispering against wet asphalt. He stepped out slowly, as if timing his entrance mattered. Crowley was a man in his late 40s, tall and well-proportioned, with a face that had been trained into pleasant angles. His hair was a careful side part, brown with only the faintest hint of gray at the temples, and his jaw was clean-shaven, smooth in a way that suggested regular mirrors and deliberate grooming. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, the fabric untouched by the town's usual dust, paired with a white shirt and a narrow dark tie. His shoes were polished enough to reflect the broken sky. Everything about him said control, over his appearance, his voice, and, if possible, the people in front of him. Wyatt was tightening a hinge on the shop's front door when Crowley walked in. He did not turn immediately. Coda did. The Belgian Malinois rose in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Wyatt and the newcomer. His posture was alert but not aggressive, ears upright, dark amber eyes fixed on Crowley's hands. He did not bark. He did not move forward. He simply occupied space with quiet authority. Crowley paused, his smile tightening for a fraction of a second before settling back into place. "That must be the dog," he said pleasantly. "Impressive animal." Wyatt straightened and faced him. "What do you want?" Crowley's eyes flicked over Wyatt's uniform, lingering for just a moment longer than polite. "Straight to business. I like that." He extended a hand, then withdrew it when Wyatt made no move to shake. "Dean Crowley. I handle acquisitions in this part of the county." Evie emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a cloth. The moment she saw Crowley, her shoulders stiffened. "I told you I wasn't interested," she said. Crowley's smile widened, practiced and calm. "Evelyn," I was hoping the storm might give you time to reconsider. He placed a leather folder on the counter and opened it with deliberate care. Inside were neatly stacked documents, clipped and labeled. This offer stands. Cash. Clean. Enough to make the rest of your life comfortable. Evie did not look at the papers. I don't need comfort. I need my shop. Crowley sighed softly, as if disappointed by a child's stubbornness. This isn't just about the shop. It's about progress. This entire block is aging out.
Repairs cost more every year. Insurance will only cover so much after storms like the one we just had. He glanced toward the cracked window. Nature has a way of deciding these things for us. Wyatt's jaw tightened. You done? Crowley turned his attention back to him, eyes cool now. You must be new here, he said. People usually let me finish. Evie leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp. Get out. For a moment, something flickered behind Crowley's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. Then his voice dropped, losing its warmth. You're an old woman living alone in a failing building, he said quietly. Another storm like that, and you might not be so lucky. The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat shouted. Coda shifted, stepping closer to Wyatt's leg, his body angled toward Crowley. Not attacking. Warning. Crowley noticed. His gaze dropped briefly to the dog, then lifted again. Think about it, he said, closing the folder. I'll give you a few days. He turned and left without waiting for a response. That evening, the stone came through the front window without warning. It shattered glass across the shop floor, the sound sharp and violent in the early dusk. Evie flinched, a hand flying to her chest. Wyatt was already moving, stepping in front of her as Coda surged toward the door, stopping short of crossing the threshold. Outside, footsteps retreated into the dark. Sheriff Nolan Briggs arrived 20 minutes later, raincoat unbuttoned, radio clipped at his shoulder. He was a solid man in his 50s, with a square face and tired eyes, his short hair graying at the edges. His uniform looked worn but serviceable, boots scuffed from years of walking the same streets. He surveyed the damage with a frown that suggested paperwork rather than outrage. Kids, probably, Nolan said after a brief look around. Storms got people wound up. Wyatt met his gaze. Stone came from the alley, thrown hard. Not kids. Nolan raised an eyebrow but made no comment, jotting something in his notebook. We'll keep an eye out. Coda moved along the broken glass, nose low. He stopped near the doorway, sniffed once, then twice, then looked up at Wyatt. His ears tilted back slightly, a subtle signal. Oil. Old machine oil. And leather. Shoes not meant for running. Wyatt filed the detail away. After Nolan left, Evie stood staring at the shattered window. Her breathing was uneven. I knew he wouldn't take no for an answer, she said quietly. Wyatt swept the glass into a bin. He'll try again. She turned to him then, studying his face, the rigid calm that did not waver even now. You saved my life once already, she said. But this isn't your fight. You sure you want to be standing here when it comes back around? Wyatt did not answer immediately. He set the bin aside and rested a hand briefly on Coda's shoulder. I don't like bullies, he said at last. That night, Coda lay at the threshold of the shop, body aligned with the door, eyes open. He did not sleep deeply. Neither did Evie. Near midnight, she began coughing, hard, racking coughs that bent her forward. Wyatt was at her side instantly, steadying her as she struggled to breathe. When the fit passed, she sagged against the counter, pale and shaking. "Heart," she admitted after a moment. "Been bad for years. Doctor says stress doesn't help." She managed a thin smile.
Seems I've been collecting plenty of that. Wyatt looked around the shop. The broken glass, the aging walls, the place that was clearly more than just wood and nails to her. Outside, the street was quiet, but Coda remained at his post, watchful, unwavering. Evie followed Wyatt's gaze and nodded slowly. "I don't have as much time as I thought," she said. "That's the truth of it." Wyatt said nothing, but the way he stood, solid, immovable, made it clear he had heard. Coda lifted his head slightly, eyes fixed on the darkened street beyond the door, as if already anticipating what would come next. Morning light filtered into Harrow and Son Repairs plus Antiques in a thin, pale wash, revealing every crack in the wood and every scuff on the counter that Evie had polished by hand for decades. The shop smelled faintly of old paper, machine oil, and yesterday's coffee. Evie sat upright in a straight-backed chair near the counter, hands folded in her lap, her silver hair pinned neatly despite the long night behind her. She looked smaller than usual, but her eyes were sharp, alert, watching everything. Wyatt stood near the back shelves, pretending to sort tools while listening. Coda lay at his feet, body relaxed but ears half raised, never fully at rest. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Marla Keene stepped inside. Marla was a woman in her early 40s, tall and composed, with straight dark hair pulled into a tight bun at the base of her neck. Her face was angular, her features precise, softened only slightly by faint smile lines around her mouth. She wore a black blazer over a neutral blouse and tailored slacks, practical heels clicking quietly against the wooden floor. A leather briefcase hung from her hand, scuffed just enough to show it had been used, not displayed. Her eyes moved quickly, taking in the broken window now boarded up, the reinforced door, the dog at Wyatt's side. "Mrs. Harrow," Marla said, extending a hand. "You sounded concerned on the phone." Evie took her hand firmly. "That's one way to put it." They sat at the small table near the front, papers spread between them. Wyatt caught fragments as he worked, legal terms, phrases like beneficiary, contest, property rights. One word landed heavier than the rest. Will. Evie glanced toward Wyatt, then back to Marla. "I want it done clean," she said. "No room for tricks." Marla nodded. "You have the legal right to leave your property to anyone you choose, but I won't sugarcoat it. There will be challenges. Mr. Crowley has already filed preliminary claims tied to future development investments in this area. He's positioning himself." Evie's mouth tightened. Figures. Wyatt felt the weight of the conversation settle into his chest. He did not step closer, but Evie's gaze found him again. "I don't trust anyone else in this town anymore," she said quietly. "But I trust the way you stood in the storm and didn't run." Wyatt met her eyes, surprised by the directness. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," Evie replied. "That's why it matters." Marla followed the exchange carefully, her expression unreadable. "If you intend to name Mr. Hale as a beneficiary," she said, "I'll need some time to prepare for potential disputes." Evie nodded once. "Do it." As if on cue, Coda rose. Not suddenly, not urgently. He stood with deliberate calm and walked toward the storage corner near the back of the shop. His nose hovered just above the wooden floorboards, tracing a slow line. Then he stopped. He lifted one paw and scratched lightly, once, twice, then froze, staring at the floor. Wyatt's attention snapped fully to him. "That's the third time this week," Evie murmured. Wyatt knelt, running his fingers along the boards. One plank near the edge of the storage area was a shade darker than the rest, the grain slightly different. The nails were newer. He pressed down. It did not creak like the others. "Someone replaced this," he said. Evie exhaled slowly, as if a long-held breath had finally found release. "I was wondering when he'd show himself." She sat back, eyes distant. "My husband, Thomas. He was a safe technician. Banks, private collections. People trusted him with things they didn't want anyone else to know about." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "There was a job years ago. Something went missing. Officially, it was written off. Unofficially," she shook her head. "Thomas said some things shouldn't go back into greedy hands." Marla looked up sharply. "Mrs. Harrow?" Evie raised a hand. "I'm not saying there's gold under my floor. I'm saying my husband believed in keeping certain things safe." Her gaze shifted to Wyatt. "And if I'm gone, I don't want Crowley anywhere near it." That night, the wind returned. It wasn't a storm like before, but it carried enough force to rattle the boarded window and set the sign outside creaking. Wyatt had just finished securing the last latch when Coda stiffened, ears snapping forward. A soft metallic scrape sounded at the back door. Wyatt moved without hesitation. He signaled Coda low with 2 fingers. The dog slid into position, muscles coiled, silent. The door shuddered as someone tested it again, harder this time. Wyatt opened it abruptly. The man outside stumbled back, crowbar clattering to the ground. He was thin, hood pulled low, face sharp and nervous, the smell of oil and cold metal clinging to him. His eyes widened when he saw the dog. Coda did not bite. He stepped forward, angling his body to cut off escape, pressing the man sideways with controlled force, herding him toward the wall. The intruder panicked, swinging wildly, but Coda stayed just out of reach, driving him exactly where Wyatt needed him. Wyatt slammed him into the wall, twisting his arm behind his back. "Don't move," he said flatly. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had finally called it in. When it was over, Evie stood in the doorway, wrapped in a cardigan, watching as the man was taken away. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "That's Crowley's way," she said. "Pressure until something breaks." Later, when the shop was quiet again, Evie sat at the counter with a single envelope. She wrote slowly, deliberately, then sealed it and slid it across to Wyatt. "Only open this if I'm gone," she said. Wyatt looked at the envelope, then back at her. "You planning on leaving anytime soon?" Evie smiled faintly. "No, but I've learned not to assume I'll have tomorrow." Coda settled at her feet, resting his head against her ankle. Evie's hand found his fur, and for a moment the tension eased. Outside, the street was dark. But inside the shop, something had shifted. Quietly, irrevocably. The collapse came without drama. One moment Evie was standing behind the counter, carefully aligning a stack of repaired ledgers as she had done 1,000 times before. Her movements slow but precise. The next, her hand slipped. The ledgers fell. Evie swayed once, as if the floor had tilted beneath her, then folded quietly to her knees. Wyatt was there before the sound fully registered. He caught her shoulders as she sagged forward, lowering her to the floor with controlled urgency. Her skin felt cold and damp beneath his hands. Her breathing was shallow, uneven.
Coda reacted instantly. The Belgian Malinois sprang forward, nose pressed to Evie's face, then snapped his head up and locked eyes with Wyatt. His posture was rigid, alert, his tail still. No panic, just focus. He whined once, low and sharp, then turned and bolted toward the door before circling back, urging movement. Wyatt scooped Evie up with practiced efficiency, adjusting his grip to protect her chest and neck. Outside, a thin drizzle had begun to fall, blurring the streetlights and soaking into the cracked pavement. Coda ran ahead, stopping at the edge of the curb, watching Wyatt maneuver Evie into the back seat of the truck. Evie regained consciousness briefly as they drove. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Storm passed," she murmured faintly, voice barely audible over the rain. "You're going to be fine," Wyatt said, though he did not know if it was true. She smiled weakly. "I knew you'd come when it mattered." She survived the night, but she did not survive the week. Age, stress, and a heart that had been working too long under too much weight finally caught up with her. Evie Harrow passed quietly in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and rain-damp coats, with Wyatt sitting beside her bed and Coda lying at his feet, head resting against the metal frame. In her final moments, Evie reached for Wyatt's hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't let them turn this place into ash," she whispered. "It's more than wood." Wyatt nodded once. "I won't." Her fingers relaxed. The monitor stilled. The reading of the will took place 3 days later in Marla Keene's office, a narrow room lined with law books and framed certificates. Marla sat straight-backed at her desk, glasses perched low on her nose, voice calm and measured as she read. Evie had left 70% ownership of Harrow & Son Repairs Plus Antiques, along with full residential rights to the upstairs quarters, to Wyatt Hale. The remaining interest was allocated to a small local preservation fund, with a single, explicit condition. The shop must remain operational as a repair business and antique store for a minimum of 1 year, and under no circumstances could it be sold to Dean Crowley during that period. Crowley was not present, but his reaction arrived quickly. By the end of the week, legal notices piled onto Marla's desk. Crowley's attorneys accused Wyatt of manipulation, undue influence, and emotional coercion. They questioned Wyatt's mental stability, his military background framed as evidence of volatility rather than discipline. They implied Evie had been pressured, isolated, confused. Wyatt read the filings without visible reaction. His jaw tightened slightly, nothing more. That night, alone in the shop, he finally opened the envelope Evie had given him. Inside was a small brass key, worn smooth with age. Tucked beside it was a folded slip of paper with a single line written in Evie's steady hand. "Coda knows where." Wyatt looked up. Coda was already standing. The dog moved with absolute certainty, padding across the shop to the storage corner. He stopped at the same section of floor he had marked days earlier. This time, he did not scratch. He sat, straight-backed, still. His gaze lifted to Wyatt and held. Wyatt knelt, pried up the darker plank, and revealed a narrow cavity beneath. Inside was a rusted steel safe, smaller than he expected, its surface scarred and pitted with age. The key slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting. The safe opened with a dry metallic click. Inside were not stacks of cash, not gold or jewels. There were documents, deeds, land surveys, burn reports, old zoning approvals, stamped and restamped, signatures layered over one another, and photographs, grainy but clear, showing a warehouse fire from 15 years earlier. Flames tearing through a block Crowley now claimed had been blighted beyond repair. Notes in the margins referenced insurance payouts, emergency permits, and shell companies with names that circled back to Crowley's acquisition firm. Wyatt sat back on his heels, the weight of it settling in. Evie hadn't been hiding wealth. She had been hiding truth. Coda leaned forward, resting his chin against Wyatt's knee, eyes steady and calm, as if to say, "This is why." Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside the shop, the past finally breathed. And somewhere across town, Dean Crowley's empire began to crack. Marla Keene did not raise her voice when she explained the process. She never did. She sat across from Wyatt at her desk, spine straight, fingers interlaced, dark eyes steady behind thin-framed glasses. Everything about her suggested order. The neat bun at the nape of her neck, the sharp crease in her blazer, the careful way she chose each word. "We do this by the book," she said. "Chain of custody, formal filings, no shortcuts, not even when the other side cheats." Wyatt nodded. He had not come here for money. He had not even come for ownership. He had come because an old woman had trusted him with something that mattered, and he intended to keep that promise. "I just want to keep the shop open," he said, "and keep Crowley away from it." Marla's lips pressed into a thin line. "That won't be easy. Mr. Crowley has resources, and he's already using them." The pressure began quietly. Anonymous letters slid under the shop door, words clipped and threatening, ink heavy with implication. The power cut out twice in 1 week, always just long enough to spoil work and unsettle nerves. On the town's online boards, posts appeared questioning Wyatt's past, twisting his military service into something unstable, dangerous. Old photos were dragged up without context. Whispers grew louder. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stopped by less often. When he did, he lingered at the door, hands on his belt, eyes avoiding Wyatt's. Nolan was not a bad man, but he was tired, worn thin by years of choosing the path that caused the least immediate trouble. And Crowley knew how to apply pressure. Coda sensed the shift before anyone else did. The Malinois began pacing at night, ears pricked at every distant sound. He checked doors twice, then 3 times, nose tracing the seams of the building. He slept lightly, rising at the smallest creak. Wyatt trusted that vigilance more than his own. The night before the preliminary hearing, Coda woke Wyatt with a low, urgent whine. Wyatt sat up instantly, heart already racing. The air smelled wrong, sharp, chemical. Gasoline. Coda was at the stairs, body angled toward the back of the shop, muscles taut. He did not bark. He did not hesitate. He simply waited, eyes locked on Wyatt. Wyatt grabbed his jacket and moved. The glow was faint at first, an orange pulse at the edge of the storage room. Then the smell intensified. Someone had soaked the rear wall and left a trail. Wyatt cursed under his breath, yanked open the emergency exit, and shoved the safe, Evie's safe, onto a dolly. Flames licked up the old wood as he rolled it toward the front. Coda stayed close, guiding, nudging when smoke thickened, forcing Wyatt to change angle, just as a beam cracked and fell where he had been standing seconds before. The heat roared, alarms screamed. They got most of it out, not everything, but enough. The fire department arrived fast. Red lights cut through smoke and rain. Firefighters hauled hoses, boots pounding wet pavement. The blaze was contained before it could take the entire block. An arson investigator arrived before dawn, a woman in her late 30s with a compact build and ash-smudged face, hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She introduced herself briefly, eyes sharp, movements efficient. "This wasn't electrical," she said after a quick survey. "Accelerant, deliberate." Security footage sealed it. A hooded figure, a familiar sedan idling too close to the alley. The timestamp lined up perfectly with the power outage reported earlier that night. Sheriff Nolan arrived last, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He took in the scene, the cameras, the investigators' notes. His jaw tightened. For the first time in weeks, he met Wyatt's eyes directly. "I should have listened sooner," he said quietly. At the hearing, Crowley arrived confident. He wore a navy suit this time, darker than before, his smile polished and cold. He sat with his legal team, fingers steepled, projecting patience. His argument was simple. Evie had been vulnerable, confused. Wyatt had taken advantage of her isolation. The inheritance, he claimed, was the result of manipulation. Marla waited. Then she stood. She submitted Evie's handwritten letter, the one written after the break-in, the one placed deliberately into the record. Evie's words were clear, her handwriting steady. She described the storm, the falling tree, the man who had stood between her and death without asking for anything in return. She described why she chose Wyatt, not out of confusion, but out of certainty. Marla followed with video. The footage played in silence. Rain, wind, a collapsing oak, Wyatt moving, and Coda, alert, controlled, positioning himself exactly where the danger would be. The branch fell where Coda had blocked moments earlier. Gasps rippled through the room. Crowley's smile faltered. The judge leaned forward. Marla finished calmly. This was not coercion. This was gratitude and trust. When the ruling came, it was temporary but decisive. Wyatt was recognized as the lawful heir pending final resolution. The investigation into the fire would continue. Crowley stood abruptly, face pale for the first time. His control cracked. For a brief moment, his eyes flicked to Coda, and something like fear passed through them. Outside the courthouse, Wyatt knelt and rested his forehead against Coda's. The dog stood steady, tail low, eyes calm. They had not won everything, but the truth was no longer burning. And for the first time since Evie's passing, the shop's lights stayed on through the night. The documents from the safe did not explode into the news the way scandals usually did. They moved slower than that, through offices and filing systems, across desks where people leaned back in their chairs and frowned, then leaned forward again. Parcel maps that did not align, signatures that repeated themselves too precisely, transfer dates that coincided with fires, floods, and unavoidable losses. What had once looked like aggressive development began to look like a pattern. The investigation widened. Crowley stopped coming into town as often. When he did, he kept his head down, his tailored confidence fraying at the edges. The polite smile still appeared, but it arrived a fraction of a second too late, like a mask being adjusted after it slipped. People noticed. They always did, eventually. Wyatt noticed something else. Silence. The threats stopped. The power stayed on. The town boards grew quieter, then shifted to other concerns. Winter supplies, road repairs, whose roof still needed fixing before the first heavy snow. With Marla's guidance, Wyatt used the funds he was legally allowed to touch, insurance payouts, a modest settlement advance approved while the case continued, to begin repairs. He worked early mornings and late evenings, sleeves rolled up, hands steady, doing as much as he could himself. The shop smelled of fresh-cut wood and old oil, a combination that felt right. He refused to replace the sign. The wood was weathered, the paint chipped and faded, but the name still held. Harrow and Son. Beneath it, in smaller lettering that did not demand attention, he added a simple line. Restored by Wyatt Mercer. No flourish, no claim of ownership beyond stewardship. Inside, the changes were careful, respectful. He reinforced the beams without hiding the scars. He kept Evie's workbench exactly where it had always been, tools arranged as she had left them. The corner where the fire had burned hottest was repaired last, the new boards deliberately left a shade lighter, a quiet reminder rather than a cover-up. The loft became something new. Wyatt cleared it out, reinforced the railing, and set up a small station with basic tools and donated parts. Word spread quickly. Older residents came first, tentative, embarrassed to ask. Wyatt never asked questions. He fixed walkers, tightened bolts on wheelchairs, cleaned battery contacts on portable oxygen units. He did it quietly, efficiently, and without charge. When people tried to pay, he shook his head. Evie wouldn't have liked that, he said, and that was enough. Coda adapted to the new rhythm as if he had been waiting for it. The Malinois took up position by the door, body relaxed but alert, eyes tracking movement on the street. Children learned quickly that the dog was not to be rushed, but once trust was earned, Coda accepted careful hands and soft voices. People lingered longer when he was there. Conversations slowed. The shop felt safer, anchored. Sheriff Nolan came by one afternoon without his hat. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, hands empty, shoulders heavy. Up close, the lines on his face showed more clearly, etched by years of compromise he was no longer proud of. "I should have done better," he said. "With Evie. With you." Wyatt did not let the silence stretch too long. "You're here now," he replied. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a door left open. One evening, as the first real cold settled into the town, Wyatt found Coda standing in front of a drawer that had always been stuck. It was an old thing, part of a cabinet everyone had assumed was empty. Coda did not paw at it. He did not bark. He simply stood there, staring, tail still, ears forward. Wyatt frowned. "What is it?" Coda glanced at him once, then back at the drawer. Wyatt pulled it open with effort. Inside lay a single photograph, curled at the edges. Evie stood beside a younger man, her husband, both of them smiling in a way that was unguarded and rare. They stood in front of the shop, the sign newly painted, the future wide open behind them. On the back, in Evie's neat hand, were the words, "Home isn't walls, it's who keeps the promise." Wyatt closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle where it belonged. The final ruling came quietly. Crowley's challenges collapsed under the weight of evidence. Charges followed, not all of them dramatic, but enough. Enough to stop him from circling back. Enough to give the town breathing room. Winter arrived in earnest. On the first night the temperature dropped hard, Wyatt locked up the shop and stood beneath the sign. The lights glowed warm against the dark street, a small, stubborn beacon. He checked the door twice, habit ingrained, then rested a hand on Coda's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, steady and present. Wyatt did not feel like a man who had won something. He felt like a man who had been given a place to stand. Destiny had not handed him gold or escape. It had handed him responsibility, and the quiet, unshakable sense that this was where he was meant to be. Together they walked into the cold, the sign behind them holding firm against the wind.
Sometimes miracles are not loud. They arrive as instincts, as timing, as someone who does not walk away. God does not always stop the storm. Sometimes He sends protection through it, through courage, through loyalty, through a heart willing to listen. If this story touched you, remember that your presence may be the answer to someone else's prayer. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and subscribe for more stories of quiet miracles. May God watch over you, protect your path, and bless your days. Thank you for being here.